Good afternoon and welcome to this session called Opening the Black Box on Humanitarian Decision Making. My name is Lars Nissen. I'm the director of ACAPS, and for the next 90 minutes we will explore decision making, what this means for the humanitarian sector. And you have to see this panel in relation to last year's panel where we talked about catching the black swan. So we focus very much on how do we do assessments of very ambiguous crises? How do we spot the black swan? How can we build an evidence base that is strong enough for us to know what's going on? And I think if you look at the marketplace here at the conference, you'll see a multitude of different platforms and projects on collecting data, on building different dashboards. We are very happy talking about how to collect data and build evidence base. We talk much less about how that data is used and how it makes a difference.
Tell me, Jardy. Yo!
Humanitarian to admit that he or she made a decision. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. We're very happy to hide behind the data and say, oh, you know, this assessment tells me to go left or tells me to go right. But reality really is that decision-making is political in nature. It entails a choice. There are things we choose not to do. And somehow we should be held accountable for those decisions so that we can learn and do better. And so that's the broad topic we want to explore over the next 90 minutes. We are, of course, acutely aware of the optics here. It's a manual with 4 white men, and we, just before we get cancelled on Twitter, I wanted to say that was not the plan. Unfortunately, our moderator, Angelique, couldn't be here today, so I stepped in instead. And we do have Sarah with us from Nairobi online, so that's what it's. This is the panel you were supposed to see. On the panel, we have Andrew Alspach. Andrew is the chief of the information management branch in OCHA. He has an academic background in GIS and international development. And Andrew has worked more than 20 years in the humanitarian sector and has been part of the whole discussion around the needs assessment task force, the mirror, the past 10 years work on how we strengthen the evidence base. And it's great to have you on the panel today, Andrew. Secondly, we have Federico Sittaro, who is the Deputy Head of Analysis and Evidence Unit in ICRC. Federico has 15 years experience in humanitarian public health engineering and works inside ICRC on strengthening evidence base in ICRC's decision making. We look forward to hearing that perspective from your side. Thirdly, with us from Nairobi, we have Sarah. Sarah is an expert who works really at the intersection of technology, global security, and public policy, and comments a lot on the politics of technology. How do we, as humanitarians, use tech, and what is the implication, for example, of AI for decision making? Sarah is currently on a sabbatical from the British government and speaks in her own capacity on this panel. Finally, but not least, we have Ed Schenkenberg, who is the director of HERE-Geneva. HERE-Geneva looks at the gap between policy and practice, and Ed has an extensive experience in conducting evaluations and reviews of humanitarian operations, and he will speak to some of the patterns he has seen in these evaluations in terms of decision making. What are we really good at, and where lies the problems? So that's the panel we have for you today, and we'll start by each of the panelists giving 3 to 5 minutes opening statement on their take on the issue. So maybe I'd like to ask you, Andrew, to kick it off from OCHA's perspective. Where are we with decision making? What's on the agenda for you?
Thanks, Lars. I think from OCHA's side, it's pretty wide ranging, but we try to categorize the decisions and also organize how we collect information and data to inform those decisions in three basic areas. Some is categorized as strategic. So what do we need to make those kind of strategic decisions in OCHA? The next part would be operational. How do we facilitate our operations? And the last is tactical, little decisions we have to make on setting up new offices, pre-positioning something in a certain area, those kind of decisions in the organization. We organize a bit of that around something we call the humanitarian program cycle, which is a cycle that basically looks at identification of those needs, the severity of those needs, and trying to prioritize those needs, because every time we go through that exercise, we come out with more needs than we can address in their totality. The second is, after we have those needs, what do we need to put together as a response to address those needs in the operation? How much that's going to cost us? So there's the second big chunk. We are OCHA, so we are a coordinating organization, and each one of these steps means bringing a lot of players together to be on board at each one of these phases of identification and looking. And the more people we have involved in that, the better I think we can shape the decisions that are going to be made, because if we start from the questions first and then address the collection second, I think it works much better and can focus the way that we do that. The final part, and this is the part that I think needs improvement, is looking at how that response was. Did it get funded? How, if it did get funded, how did we respond to those type of needs, and the monitoring of that process. Other big areas of work would be and decision making would be around access and working on the different variables that are included in what is a very large area of access. Access includes humanitarians' access to the population, the population's access to us, and other component parts of UN access. Folks that are from the country, their access, NGO access, private sector access, all of these different components, and those all sort of break down. Each one of those working areas break down into that strategic, operational, and tactical areas that we need to address. How do we address that? Is first to think through the data sets that are common to all of these things. We have something called common operational data sets that we try to set up for all these operational environments. We try to put in place the systems that we think are needed to do the analytical processes around that, and have those proactively up and running, and the community aware of how to use those for decision making. But I think the biggest thing where sometimes I see a disconnect here is the people part of this and the decision making process. So whether that's at the identification of what are those main needs, or whether that's at the step of, okay, now we're at the analytical or interpretation process, depending on how you want to. There was a lot of analytics that led us up to different products that we have on the table in front of us to answer certain questions. Do we have the right people around the table to interpret that information to make informed decisions? Or is it our analyst or information management officer that did this analysis and just says, this is the way it is, this is the way it should be done. So I think a more inclusive analytical process, more inclusive identification process at the onset, that's where we can find efficiencies in this system. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. Now, Federico, that was from OCHA's perspective. OCHA has a role in terms of coordinating. ICRC is a very different beast, right? So why have you created a unit for evidence-based decision making? What's the agenda and what are you trying to achieve in ICRC?
This one. Yeah. So yeah, indeed, ICRC is a different beast with long history, and I think where we are right now is a consequence of this history. I think just to set the scene a bit, we need to account few drivers for the way ICRC works, and therefore how information, data, and decision are made. I think one thing to at least to mention is the funding structure. The trust and the reputation that we have had with donors has been functional to, let's say, a certain set of friendly, let's say, requirements in terms of reporting, data collection, evidence, etc. At the same time, I think it's even more important to mention that the modality of work of ICRC is to strongly invest and rely on a network of local actors that is nurtured over time, that is the way we ensure first the security of our operation and then the access and all the decision that comes with that. So I think that this, in terms of decision making, has a huge role, because honestly, what is better than an available tap of local and usually reliable information that we can access to when needed? So I think that historically, the organization has been growing and advance in this way. I think that right now, in the last few years, we are clearly in a phase of change. I think that on one side, again, there is the requirements from the donors community that are changing, that are somehow evolving, but at the same time, and maybe even with going with a higher degree of importance, is the change in needs. And one thing that at ICRC we repeat often is that in the 10 biggest operation, we are present since more than 40 years. I think the figure is 42, 43, something like that. So this, again, has an implication in the kind of data and requirements for the decision that you need. We see the change. We see that a decision for emergency interventions require a different set than decision to operate in a protracted crisis that lasts for 20, 30 years, maybe in very complicated settings like urban settings. So we see that this set of needs is changing, and therefore the needs to try to adapt, especially in this new, more complex, complicated, protracted crisis where we are already involved and where we need to honestly maintain relevancy, because it's a strategic space for the organization. Maybe, and then I will conclude for the moment, just to make some examples of what it means to work in this different sphere is, first of all, they need to understand contexts that are incredibly complicated. Urban context in protracted crisis are honestly a beast that requires a huge effort in terms of understanding. And what we see is that, again, leveraging the trust with local partner, we managed to achieve this understanding. Of course, there are multiple, all sorts of situations, but we see that we managed to achieve in different situations a great level of understanding. However, this is intrinsically vulnerable by the way we work. The rotation of staff create a situation where you have to start to learn again. So one of the things that we really we are facing and we are investing on is moving from individual learning curve to cumulative knowledge. What are the tools? What are the processes that we need? Last point I want to mention now is from an institutional setup, is the space, the room to use the actual evidence that you produce, to capitalize on the investment that you make in terms of understanding. What I mean is that, for example, the funding, if it's predefined at the beginning of a cycle, of a yearly cycle or whatever, is already somehow booked to do something. But the effort that you do in understanding such complicated context might end up with solutions that were not considered at the beginning or were not on the table. And therefore, we need to have a mechanism in place to allow for expanding on this investment in knowledge. Maybe I stop here for the moment, and I hope.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you, Federico. We'll come back to some of the points you raised there, but I'd like to bring in Sarah from Nairobi first. Are you there, Sarah?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Maybe we can turn the volume up a little bit. Sarah, you worked a lot with technology, and lately you also looked a lot at AI, and these days it almost seems like ChatGPT can actually write and not just sit fairly well. So for you, what are the implications for us as humanitarian decision makers of the way technology is developing now?
Yeah, I'll come on to some of the generative AI, including ChatGPT, GPT-4 towards the end, but there are a couple points I wanted to raise. The first is broadly around advanced technologies and the exponentially increasing amounts of data that we as aid agencies, aid actors have to hand. So that could be cold detail records, geospatial imagery, social media scraping, et cetera, and the tools that we have to process this data, like machine learning algorithms or other AI tools. So they do offer us new ways to analyze and interpret this data and information. So assessing damage, identifying need, providing services. There are some interesting use cases. I think the less, the less sort of popular use cases are probably the ones that offer potentially more opportunities for efficiencies. So I'm thinking about ways that you could use predictive analytics to, for fleet maintenance, things that are actually relatively have very low harms. We could think about ways of improving financial management and the data that we have within our aid agencies, how structured it is. There's also some increasingly interesting results around predictive analytics and anticipatory action. So there are some big multinational tech firms, which I'll come to, who have access to tremendous amounts of data, who are able to predict within relatively high levels of confidence where a flood, for example, or landslide is most likely to occur within sort of 24 hours of the event, which means that theoretically our systems should be designed to release funding down to sort of 100 square meters, 50 square meters, which it sounds, I think 2 years ago, I probably wouldn't have said any of this. And I think the way in which these systems are being developed, I think that probably is on the near horizon. And then the point that Federico just made about staff turnover, there are some tech firms who are trying to work on using these tools to build institutional memory and to address some of that. So to say ways in which we have all of these, and I speak as someone who's worked, a lot in the British government and with DFID, we have so many documents, and none of us ever go back to really see what we assessed 4 years ago or 10 years ago before we take up a role. So there is a way to sort of get tools to help us sift through. I think at last count, Relief Web had something like 900,000 different types of information, which is quite a lot. A few words on the brokers of these advanced technologies. So there are very few humanitarian actors who have the data and the computational power and the talent in-house to safely and successfully deploy these tools, which means that we're seeing increasing sort of tech for good partnerships between multinational tech firms and humanitarian agencies. That might change given the regulatory environment around AI and machine learning. And so the sort of tech titans may have to loosen their sort of monopolistic grip on these technologies, TBD. But it's worth digging into some of these partnerships. So Google and Give Directly have partnered and do, provide cash distributions within 48 hours to affected households after an event, which is quite quick. Other firms, as I mentioned before, even medium-sized firms, small to medium-sized sort of tech startups, are able to offer granular insights in almost real time down to 100 square meters, 50 square meters in terms of critical infrastructure, access to electricity, things that normally in the olden days we would have gone out and done sort of person to person and had people on motorbikes and et cetera collecting that information. So that mapping capability offers really interesting new insights. I think the other panelists have already talked about how you assess that information and then take and act on it. So I won't dive into that. But I think it is useful for us to think about the incentives that private sector actors have in these relationships and what impact that has on wider humanitarian efforts. So there is an obvious risk that aid agencies could be co-opted or instrumentalized in these wider tech for good efforts. And so, it's worth, unpacking why the tech firms themselves want to be engaged in this agenda. But it's also useful questioning how much this helpfully or unhelpfully disrupts the traditional modes of or models of aid delivery and displaces also local and indigenous justice movements and civil society. I think there's going to be a really profound impact on the sort of, either well-intentioned or sort of tongue-in-cheek effort to shift power from the global north to the global south as we increasingly sort of move towards technological tools that are trained and rely on data that's generated in primarily the global north. There in Nairobi here, there's some interesting local AI firms that are trying to build a sort of Kenyan solution and finding it incredibly difficult given the lack of actual data that they can rely on. And then the last thing I sort of want to talk about is around sort of data-driven decision-making. And, Lars, Peter, you mentioned it at the beginning, but I think Andrew's comments about strategic, operational, and tactical is helpful because we need to think about what kind of decisions we're using data to make. If we're thinking about, the selection of key target communities, if we're talking about the uptake of evidence to design interventions and programming, that's one thing. I can say as, a civil servant on sabbatical, it's really important to understand how context and politics shape decisions, and that will be no surprise to anyone in that room. And in some factors, in some cases, that plays a more significant factor than data. So I think the one sort of test is to look at the funding shortfalls in the humanitarian appeals, the annual humanitarian appeals, and compare that with the amount of data, granular or otherwise, on the crises, and question why. There's a pretty significant shortfall in the Central African Republic, for example. The UK government hasn't necessarily, been responsive to the amount of data to demonstrate need. And I think that's quite one example of how sort of foreign policy and politics really shapes funding, particularly from public purse donors, apart sort of private philanthropies. And the last thing to say, it sort of is another issue of mine, is about how humanitarian actors need to start thinking about how these technologies are going to shape the context and environments in which we work and are already doing so. So I'm going beyond sort of like drones and drone swarms and lethal autonomous weapon systems, which I know ICRC does a lot of work on, Even beyond that, I think there's some really critical tools, and I think the geopolitical competition over AI between the United States and China is playing out in sort of proxy ways, and certainly the country I live in, and is going to potentially create new challenges that humanitarians need to start thinking about now. So generative AI is one of those. I would argue that generative AI, so AI that can create images, and for those who haven't seen anything that 11 Labs does, but we could take the audio from this recording, for example, and I could create very powerful, convincing fake audio of Lars Peter saying something insane or me saying something insane. And I think what that does to the sort of fog of war already is quite terrifying, and potentially would have an impact as significant as small arms and light weapons did to conflict in the 50s and 60s or post-World War II. So it's one for us to engage with and to think about how this will affect the environments or the context in which we operate. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Lastly, Ed, you have an extensive experience as a consultant. You've seen many operations, you've gone out, you've done reviews, you've done evaluations. If you had to say, what is it we are actually good at as humanitarians in terms of making the right decisions? And where is it we really struggle? What is the pattern you see from all of those operations you have evaluated?
Thanks for that question, Lars Peter. I wasn't particularly prepared to answer that one, precisely because obviously it's much easier to say, what we're not good at than what we're good at. Although, of course, indeed, being in the domain of evaluations, we're always asked, please give us examples of good practice and so on. Just to say, I will speak in fairly general terms, but if there are people here in the room who are with UNICEF, UNHCR, WFP, IOM, Red Cross, Red Crescent organizations, NGOs such as MSF, NRC, you may recognize yourself in some of what I will be saying. So coming back perhaps then on what we're not good at or what we should become better at, let me put it that way. I think 4 quick points, if I use my 5 minutes, that I think are particularly issues when it comes to decision making. First, we call it decision making. You could also call it negotiations. Whether it's within an organization or among organizations, decision making is a negotiation process. Within organizations, it's logistics, human resources, finance, often versus operations, various departments, of course, having different interests. Among organizations, are you defending, promoting your individual organization mandate, or are you looking at it more from a collective point of view? It's particularly, I think, what Andrew also started talking about. And then also more from a humanitarian, even broader perspective. Are we particularly focused on this providing assistance, or is this more of a protection crisis? And obviously there's also often a perceived tension, at least, between assistance and protection. So those, at least, are some of the tensions or some of the different interests that immediately play up in a negotiation, and that make decision-making largely a negotiations process in our experience. What we then see, and which is closely related to this, is questions around prioritization. And again, this is within, well, even organizations that have a single mandate and that work in a single sector, health, MSF, you can think of many other examples. Of course, immediately they have difference of views in terms of where the priorities are, let alone when you're a multi-mandate organization, which is what most of us are. Is it a wars crisis? Is it a child protection crisis? Is it a GBV crisis? Is it, education? All of the above, probably. But which comes first is then exactly, again, the question around prioritization. And clearly what we see there is that, and this is then particularly where the issue of money comes in. Well, UNICEF, and I think I can mention particularly UNICEF because I do think that this actually is an example of good practice. UNICEF has this word intersectorality, which brings these various, a GBV combined approach with child protection or education. I mean, you can think of all these examples where you actually combine sectors, so to speak, and you get more intersectoral or integrated approach. And we do see sometimes good examples of that, but also because, and precisely because of donor pressures or expectations, at least from the donors, there is a demand for profile from these different sectors, even with one organization, to actually be recognized for what they do and to, to mobilize the resources for their particular area. So, again, it really in that sense, and certainly, and I don't think this is just UN organizations, many organizations, saying no to a donor when it comes, with earmarked money, I think no is not often part of the humanitarian vocabulary, so to speak. So, we do more. Yeah, it's the basic issue there as such. Thirdly, the issue that we particularly see in relation to decision making and negotiation is the issue of leadership and accountability. Where, when, and who particularly is involved in decision making. And you already mentioned your example, Lars Peter, in your introduction as such, which I think is a good example. And especially in collective decision making, there is a question there, the leadership, is it all among those who are around the table? Is it particularly one person? How do we organize a decision making process? Our experience, our evidence, if you like, particularly points the more sensitive, controversial decision making process is, the least accountable, the less transparent and accountable it is. Really hard to find who and where, when the decision was made in an organization. And I have plenty of examples of that. And that brings me to my fourth and last point, links also to what Sarah has said, and she's much more competent to speak about technology and data and everything than I am. Yet, and again, this is based on our experience and our findings, if you are a believer that technology can help in developing an objectively verifiable body of data or evidence, forget it. That does not exist. Even because, and again, especially the more political, the more political the situations are, and particularly in where we work as humanitarians, every situation nowadays is very political. There are alternative facts. So when we come up with what we think is evidence, we still find our findings rejected. Stop there.
Excellent. Thank you, Ed. So we've had 4 different perspectives on decision making. I'll just ask each of the panelists a follow-up question, and then we open up to questions from the room. And I'd like to start with you, Andrew, right? You just heard Ed speak about how political it can be, how evidence is rejected. You worked with OCHA for many years. We have developed, I don't know how many information vehicles and who said 900,000 documents on Relief Web. I have a proposal, right? You're no longer allowed to develop anything new within information management. Focus should exclusively be on getting the right people around the table when decisions are made. And we need to focus, really zoom in on those decisions and improve that, evidence is not the bottleneck, is what I'm pushing you to react to.
Evidence is not
Forget about collecting more evidence and let's focus on using what we have better.
Yeah, I like that. It's worse than even described. On it gets caught up in the politics. We're assuming that people are going to be literate enough in interpreting and understanding the data, and it's getting more and more complex. We're putting up dashboards with graphs and charts and drilling down, and before you know it, they don't even know what they're looking at sometimes on some of these analytical products we're putting out there. And we're assuming that a senior decision maker is going to, oh yeah, all the answers are up there on that dashboard. We got all the data, everything down there. So you're assuming some level of data literacy, not to mention the factor of actually all I'm going to do is make my decisions based on the politics of this situation, because that's, politics is absolutely, I completely agree. I completely agree with that. I don't think it's always the deciding factor, but certainly you have to consider that. And I don't think the data for the evidence is not always considered in that. And I think arguments can be made up to a point, but maybe it gets trumped by that political side. So what would I do if I didn't have to? I'd be out of a job. I think, being the information management officer, mainly focused on data. But I mean, I think it's something definitely we as OCHA are looking at as an organization on how do we organize ourselves to leverage the information that we already have at our fingertips and focus. You know, it's switching a paradigm that I think we've had, which is sort of 80% collection, accumulation of data, processing that a bit, turning that into more information that goes up on Relief Web, and flipping that around and putting the 80% on convening folks on looking at how we can derive information that can inform decisions on the body of knowledge that we have. Some of this, as Sarah was pointing out, we have a treasure trove of information on Relief Web, and technology could help us, you know, filter that so that it's a much more targeted on that decision-making side. And we can think about leveraging that technology in a responsible way to do that, because I've attended 3 other sessions here and they've all been on, you know, the counterpoint of using these kind of technologies responsibly for decision making. So I mean, we have plenty of work in that area, in the area of data literacy, in the area of how do we organize ourselves as an organization, and we have a role in the community as well, to show leadership and how we would organize interagency discussions for decision making as well. Yeah, I'm sure that my section actually could go away if it could continue to do what it was doing before, and we could focus more on how do we leverage this information that we have available to us currently. Over.
Thank you. Now, if we then turn to ICRC, what is your challenge, right? Because you're very, very different from OCHA in terms of setup, in terms of culture. You are very closely knit operational organization with a strong management. When I used to work in ICRC, that was one of the things that really struck me. Is it really a question of just getting better evidence, learning more from these protracted crises, using the data and the knowledge you have better to deal with the turnover on and all of that? Or do you also have some of the same political issues around decision making that Andrew spoke about?
Honestly, I think that many, if not all, the points mentioned are very relevant for us as well. I would like to follow up on something you said about the nature of the evidence. That there is certainly a political side that, of course, again, is not depending on the organization, is depending on the context of the situation you are in. And that nature of the evidence, I think, again, it's something that, again, I speak for the ICRC, but I'm pretty sure it's a generalizable concept. We need to learn how to deal with this nature of evidence. It's not an ideal data that will perfectly and this is it. There is the decision is taken because this is perfectly answering the question. It will never be like this. It's not in a rich data country. It can't be in context where it's much less than that. One other, so it's really handling the assumptions that we use to interpret that type of data, that type of evidence. So for me, it's really creating the condition in which those assumptions are transparently recorded and then evaluated over time. The point is not to make decisions that are right or good. The point is to make a decision that are appropriate in the given situation and have the capacity to learn from them. And this in itself is one of those institutional changes that I was mentioning before, because this goes beyond the outcome of whatever you have done. It goes beyond the monitoring of the intervention. It really challenged the moment you took that decision. And in order to be able to challenge that, you need to have a system in place that record whatever assumption you have used. I wanted to make another comment on that, on the literacy. I think I really, the dashboard, the complicated, because it's possible to do these things, they are done. So you see plenty of things that are popping up, etc. Of course, there is the issue of the data literacy, but the literacy, I mean, it's in whatever sector. What métier doesn't need more expertise at whatever level? I really think that here, one of the systemic point is maybe we should focus a little bit more on the questions rather than the answer that the data can provide. How we generate new questions, how we challenge previous questions. So I really think that that is a little bit the key where the whole well,
Excellent. Sorry. Thank you for that answer. It really resonates a lot with I think the way we also in ACAPS think about decision making. Sarah, as a follow-up to you, I'd like to ask, I mean, we hear these challenges that are around decision making. This is very difficult territory because it's political, because it involves the bosses making decisions, because nobody likes to be held accountable. And then we enter on top of that rampant technological development. How, from your perspective, how can we ensure transparency and accountability in decision making in this situation?
It's a really good question, and I was thinking to myself while Ed was talking about controversial decisions being made are the least transparent, if I heard you correctly, and that is really fascinating because the standards to which we're holding technologies and new technologies to the debates around explainable AI, the debates around sort of accountability for algorithmic decisions, who's to blame, the engineer behind the algorithm or the person who's taking the decision. I mean, it's sort of like plus que change, plus c'est la même chose, right? Like, it's like we've just transplanted our problems with decision making onto these technologies. And they don't seem any different than the challenges we already have within our decision-making processes. I just have to say as a footnote, in case it sounds like I come across as a techno-optimist, Lars Peter can probably attest that I most certainly am not, but I think we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm sort of crying for the humanitarian community to come together to set the agenda or establish some kind of pathway or guidance on how humanitarians broadly should be engaging with new technologies and what the limits could be. We've certainly had, in Kenya, we've had some really interesting discussions with development actors here and some humanitarian actors here on the ethical limitations of AI in humanitarian cases and in the sort of delivering the SDGs. But I think, without setting the standards or setting the agenda, then we end up operating, as individual agencies who sort of, some of them are incredibly technophobic and sort of say, we're not going to engage with any of it, which will pose significant problems, I suggest, in the long term. ICRC's got a great handbook that's, incredibly detailed and offers a lot of useful advice. But what I worry about, and I think it came across when Andrew was making his point about data literacy, is that there's like a wide digital literacy problem as well within the industry. One last thing to say is that in some of the research I'd done for the humanitarian practice group a while ago, there were some people with whom I spoke on the humanitarian side of things rather than the technological side, who couldn't really even understand that clouds were terrestrial objects, that they actually existed on the planet Earth somewhere. And that's not to sort of point fingers at people who don't really understand the details behind technology, but we lose if we don't keep up. And I think we need to understand not only how these are shaping the context in which we operate, as I said before, but also what are the red lines? Like what can we engage in and what can't we engage in? And how do we make sure we're setting reasonable standards for ourselves and for the uptake of those technologies?
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Now, finally, Ed, I'd like to ask you, I mean, there's been 4 excellent interventions from you as panelists. The problems you described at the same time are depressingly familiar, right? For me, a lot of it boils down to where you stand depends on where you sit. We are driven by an underlying incentive structure around individual agendas rather than a collective one. And so you look at the gap between policy and practice, and my question is, isn't that pretty much a stable gap? Hasn't that gap been there forever? And can we really change it without changing the humanitarian architecture?
Good question. Again, Lars Peter. Let me take this example, which very much also goes back to the issue around decision making. We've done quite a bit of work on understanding how organizations, everyone, and I imagine everyone in this room would also say his or her organization is delivering principled humanitarian action. I haven't heard few humanitarian organizations saying we're not delivering principled action. So our work has been around, okay, if you're as an organization are saying we're delivering principled humanitarian action, show us. What does that mean? How do you take the humanitarian principles into account? Which precisely also go in terms of the gap between policy and practice, because exactly everyone is committed to delivering principled humanitarian action. So show us. And that actually goes then in a way to what Federico was saying, I think. It's not so much the exact decision that was taken, because clearly World Vision will have a different interpretation of humanitarian principles than MSF, and ICRC will come out differently than Oxfam or UN agency. We all accept that. The point is actually what you want to unpack that decision making and establish where is it that actually, where does this gap come from, if you see what I mean? In the sense that, so we're in the decision making, we're all the right or all the considerations that should be taken into account, were they taken into account? So you want to trace that decision-making process, so to speak, because that way you understand where you can come to an understanding where that gap is and perhaps address it.
Thank you, Ed. Great, so we'll move on to the Q&A session. I'm sure we have plenty of questions from the room. Anybody? Maybe not. Luke?
Yep, building on that particular point, actually. And just in terms of what we're talking about, obviously, black box thinking, we all know this as the black box being something that we can't see inside. We don't know what it is exactly. But there is another way of thinking about black box thinking, and that's from the aviation industry, whereby they track exactly what decision is made and they learn from it. And they only do that because they're very open, they're very transparent, they tell exactly how decisions are made, and when they go wrong, they learn from them and they change and they update their protocols as a result. And that's, I guess, my challenge to you, or for you to talk about your organization's approach to transparency. You talked about that in some of the panelists did, at least. And so, yeah, I can give an example. I work for the IFRC. We have on a Go platform a record from all the DREF operations, which is the Disaster Relief Emergency Fund operations, a record from over 100 national societies, over 6,000 individual snippets, lessons that have been learned from those operations, categorized according to an analytical framework. We don't use it as much as we should. It's a dashboard, and we're planning to put that in front of people's eyeballs when they're about to make those decisions, and be able to work out exactly what that workflow would be. What kinds of decisions are we making, and with what evidence? But what I'd be interested to know is, how do we find out how different organizations do make their decisions at those different levels? Where can we find that?
Good, so that when something goes wrong and the plane crashes, we open the black box and look exactly at what went wrong. Andrew, is that a model for us?
Thanks. So good question. I mean, from OCHA's standpoint, I think that any of the, we rely on that evidence, and most of that evidence comes from partners, and it's our job to sort of make that as transparent as possible and available. We have platforms such as the data exchange platform and things like that, that we try to institutionalize the data that comes in there and make it available to the humanitarian community to our best of our ability. Also put metadata, on the data that's out there. I think so. OCHA is our job is pretty much, if you can't share it with others, then it doesn't have much. It has limited value to OCHA. So. And what we need when people are sharing information, data with us is to know the quality of that information, where it came from, and all of the transparency that's around those data sets before we can feel confident sharing it with others. So we sort of advocate in that way. I mean, I think institutionally, though, what you said about knowledge means that an organization has a robust way to manage knowledge in the organization and learn from that. In that area, I think we have plenty of room to improve.
Maybe, yeah.
Can I add an aspect to this that is a cultural one? I think that as a sector, we have all, at least I personally, in my initial experience in the field, everything is a bit about gut feelings, and everything is judged by what you do and what you see. It's the rationality of the decision is very much linked to what you get out of it. However, I think that again, the moment the horizon change and we look at intervention that are not only emergency, but they go longer, they go into very complex and complicated system, you actually don't see this outcome, and therefore there is the need to have a procedural rationality. The decision should be assessed if it's appropriate to whatever procedure you have put in place in that moment in time. The outcome of it is a different, it's of course is important, and it's the most important thing, but it can't be the only criterion that you use to assess your decision-making process.
Yeah, just picking up on a few points here, and very much thinking about some of examples that come up from our work. Precisely, so the learning aspect then from, I mean, obviously there's an accountability and a learning aspect to many evaluations. And the learning then often leads to organizational change, or should lead to organizational change, which of course is where, you know, the hard part starts. And what we often see then is that organizations seem to think that organizational change is about structures. So they first put in place the structures. And in fact, what we're saying more and more, it's not the structures, it's the behavior of people in the organization that matters. So this then goes much more towards leadership, all the soft skills around listening, engaging in dialogue, all of that, rather than the structures. I mean, the structures don't necessarily do it. It's really the behavior that comes with it.
If I may, hi, hello, Juan from the GECO, European Commission. Thank you very much for interesting all the interventions. A couple of comments, but the questions also to the panel. One specifically for Sarah. Sarah was mentioning, I mean, a lot of private sector initiatives, of course, in terms of analytics. I think there's a lot developed on analytics but you know, your analytics are as good as your data, let's say, data entry or data collection capability. And I think in many countries, the data collection is still a big question mark, or it's quite limited. And you can have a super AI, you know, doing a spectacular analytics, but if the data collection is bad, then the analytics are not good. Of course, there might be an AI that is doing data collection very well, but depends what we are talking about. No? So data collection is something to put on the table, I think, and it's very important. We have a lot of data, but what is the quality of that data? And that is a question also that goes to the black box as well. The other thing is the data literacy, and here's literacy, but also, as the colleagues mentioned, is behavior, because you have, with the same data, you have different decisions. So how you interpret the data there, and how the data is somehow supporting your decision, you know, because the same decision or two different decisions, completely different, are supported by the same data. So here, with the politics and of course behavior comes to play. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sarah, AI and the good old garbage in, garbage out problem?
It's still a problem, as we've all seen in ChatGPT and GPT-4. I think there's been, for those who don't read the Washington Post frequently, the Post did a really interesting article last week, I think, on the top sources of data for ChatGPT and GPT-4, which were quite revelatory. Some of them are quite obvious, but some of them were a little bit disconcerting. What will change is that the amount of data required to train an AI or any algorithm is increasingly reducing. So the old model would have, like 2 or 3 years ago, would have been, you know, we need to make sure we've got really clean, structured data. I can, you know, reflect on the number of humanitarian agencies I've worked for and with, and the program data that we had in Excel and the errors that we had within that, and thinking, oh, we're never going to have the data to be able to power humanitarian specific algorithms. The reality is those algorithms are just going to be repurposed and retooled, and based on the training data they've already been the data they've already been trained in. I think we're also not necessarily thinking, I think we need to go beyond just these sort of narrow use cases of a machine learning sort of predictive analytical model that, you know, OCHA could deploy, for example, through Leonardo's team, the predictive analytics team. But thinking more specifically about how AI is going to change, I mean, there's advanced technologies generally, but how they're going to just change the whole entire landscape of the countries in which we operate, you know, making decisions about whether to close borders, who to permit entry to, how you can now track individuals across multiple borders. I mean, UNHCR, I don't know if they're in the room, has data, I think, on 39 million people at last count, something like that, which is quite an awful lot of data, presumably federated and separate in different types of databases with lots of data protection measures in store. But Federico will know as well, in terms of ICRC's experience with data protection, we are all collecting significant amounts of data, and AI is also rapidly increasing the cybersecurity risks and our inability, reducing our ability to protect that data. So I think we just have to sort of think beyond those sort of narrow use cases and think about how this is really going to change the way of business.
Thank you, Sarah. There's a question over here.
Hi, this is Karin from the German Red Cross, and I would like to take a step back a little bit, because learning comes from decision making, right? So we have already taken the decision and then we learn from it. And now I'm wondering, because if we have the ideal data already, given that, or the data that works for us, but then, I mean, what we do is we put them in all those dashboards and we expect people to understand what's happening. And I mean, at the end of the day, you look at it and then you need to analyze the data on your own and then basically then come to a conclusion. And I think my question is to the panel, where do we stand in also presenting the data? Because I mean, to draw a conclusion from, I mean, data literacy is one thing, but you know, not everybody has time to be completely literate on what he's seeing on a map or on a dashboard. So I think it's also a way of how you present this and how do you tell the story? How can you, so basically, how do you get the information in a format that people understand and that they can work with? Set aside the politics, but like, how do they yeah, how is that process going, and where do we stand with that? Because I think that's a discussion we are sometimes lacking. So between data and decision making, there's lots of steps that I think we are missing in this discussion a little bit. So I'm curious to hear.
That is an excellent point, and I think we should not be so tough on dashboards. I think we've been a bit harsh. And I think in particular,
I vilify dashboard.
yeah, Andrew, you hated on dashboards. So what should we do instead?
I mean, it's also skill sets that we have in our organizations to be able to, I mean, that's another skill set, graphic design and thinking about, you know, we usually have data geeks that are visualizing, and that's why the dashboards are so bad. It's because they assume that everyone knows how to read a really complex graph because they can. And it goes back to that discussion earlier that we were talking about, like getting the right people in the room. So if you get in the right, you know, a different multi-functional perspective in the room, and they're all looking at that dashboard, and half of them say, I have no idea what that's even, I have no idea what that's telling me. Then you know you have to do that, but it's actually a good bit of effort from organizations to be able to design well products. And it's another skill set that may not be, it straddles the science and art realms to do that. But you're right, that presentation of data is really important. But I think we can also think a bit better about how we build in those decision-making processes and the kind of information products that are going to be presented at the different levels. I mean, we convened a year ago, sorry, quickly on this, we convened a year ago, you know, experts in the area of, environmental modeling, right? Because we wanted to match that science with some of this anticipatory action agenda that Sarah was mentioning. And the discussion didn't have anything to do with the hard science of modeling, you know, global models. It had to do with how do we present our data so that people, or put in place trigger mechanisms that are very clearly defined so people understand what decision needs to be made. When we pass this certain threshold, we need to release this amount of money, and we make that bridge from very complex modeling to that decision process that we can also build out and have appropriate products along that continuum.
I'd like to ask you, Ed, is it, in your experience, is it actually not the political nature of decision making nor the evidence? Is it really a communication problem we have?
I think it's more than a communications problem. No, I was thinking particularly on the situation that I'm a response, the collective response. In fact, the Intransi response to Northern Ethiopia is what I'm currently evaluating in the period November 2020 until beginning of this year, which is precisely the period of the war in Tigray. And clearly there it becomes immediately a dilemma because the data is entirely incomplete. There's no mortality nor malnutrition data available. I mean, there are many dashboards as such, but they don't tell you much exactly what already has been mentioned. So what does this lead to? Because then the point is exactly that, you know, the moment we will start drawing findings and move on to conclusions, agencies, and you know, if we would come out with sort of a findings that are negative, a negative reflection on the work of the organizations, they will of course reject that and say, you know, actually your data was incomplete. Well, true, the data for the response as such is incomplete. But what we then started to do, what we are starting to do, in fact, there's one university in Europe that exactly has done extensive modeling, which as far as I understand, modeling is state of the art, what they have done. And they have not only done that, they also combined that still with a network of local actors that they had. So even while there was an information blackout, communications blackout and so on, they in fact still managed to contact a range of local organizations or representatives as such. And on that base, so they compared the data that is available with what they got from those local sources, which we think actually leads to quite a reliable picture, if you see what I mean. Now, it will still, and I can predict this, it will still be a battle with the organizations to have them recognize that, you know, this is probably what happened on the ground. And you know, especially again, if we come to the conclusion that the response fell below a certain threshold, they probably will still push back on it. But you know, this is exactly what happens if you are in the business of evaluation and looking, you know, how data is used.
Thanks, Ed. Sarah, you want to chip in on this one?
I was just going to say, it was interesting when Andrew was talking about some of the predictive analytics work and triggers. It just, and then also on Ed's point just now, you know, the biggest problem we have, whether it's, you know, looking at advanced technologies in the humanitarian space or decision making generally, is, you know, we have to be clear on what question we're trying to solve. And I can't remember if it was Federico who said that earlier, but that is the most critical question. And it's not only always about impact. I mean, a lot of that I can attest as a former or a donor on sabbatical, you know, there is pressure on agencies to demonstrate impact, but we need to figure out what problem we're trying to solve. And I think some of my misgivings, personal misgivings around the use of advanced technologies for anticipatory action, for example, aren't really addressing the real problem at hand. What they do is overcome some of the logistical and bureaucratic nightmares that exist around funding, decision-making, and allocation. But that's our problem. That's not the problem of people in northern Burkina Faso. That's not the people in Ethiopia, right? If we're designing these really complex decision-making systems just to manage our own internal bureaucracy, then we have like missed the point, right? And I think the real problem is for us to think about what, as a collective industry, donors included, but delivery agencies as well, what are the critical issues at hand? And I would say, you know, this is maybe too strategic, but from a strategic perspective, but, you know, we've got potentially fixed, flat, or reducing resources. I mean, I know that my own government has not been, you know, washed itself in glory in the last couple of years on that front, and increasing need. You know, the estimates of global migration that will be pushing on the global north and be pushing in, you know, areas and against borders are profound, and in ways that our system is not set up to help us accelerate decision making and also acknowledge the politics that will come into play around those decisions. So I think, you know, the sense of urgency needs to you know, escalate, I think, a little bit in terms of trying to find the right problem to solve and then looking to all the tools we have to help us get to the right decision.
The point of the question, you made it, Sarah. I'm absolutely. I think it's super important, and at the same time, for the question of the colleague, I think it is an issue. It is super important. The way the story is told. At the same time, again, I want to make a strong point that we can't hyper-simplify things that are incredibly complicated. It's not only a decision, oh, yes, there will be a flood, I need to intervene, yes, no. It's that is one of the decisions. That is one of the decisions in the spectrum that exists. But it's not the only user case. What to do if the floods occur? What to do if I want to attack the root causes of that floods? That, of course, is a meteorological event. Might be also a system of network or whatever is in that context that is in context that is affecting the thing. So, for me, the challenge is, yes, we need to tell stories that are understood, that are actionable, of course, but it's much more complicated than making a good design of a dashboard that is already difficult, is to really go into the details. What about qualitative data? Because here we are shifting, we are drifting into, oh, yes, everything is quantitative. Well, actually, we all know very well, and much of your work is extremely precious in that sense. That if you really want to understand how things work, you need to go into qualitative analysis. So how do you present those? How do you connect with that level of depth to your audience? And I think I don't have the answer, but I'm sure that hyper-simplification is not the right one.
Thank you. And we have a question from Sandy online also, which is a bit along the same theme. Do any panelists have anything to say about localizing the black box? How do we include more local voices in the data that it makes a difference to key decisions? Any ideas, right? And it's right. We talk a lot about data literacy, and we talk about us, the decision makers, the professional technocracy. But what about local communities, the communities we serve? How do we let them into the box? What's the role there? How do we do that?
Good question. Good question, and now it's called localization. For me, the biggest indicator that we have not gone very far in this area is that, you know, we talked about all the products. What number of those products are in local languages? And on top of that, how many have been designed for non-literate populations or all of that? I think we've made very that's not proposing a solution here, but that's showing how I think poorly we really are addressing this. So one side of it is listening to that community and involving them in the decision-making process, the collection process. It's been mentioned multiple times, verification with them and using them as a source to triangulate information that we have from other sources. That's absolutely right, but it's also getting that information back to them in a way that they can use to answer questions that they want to answer. I mean, I said this phrase yesterday to Lars, that we can become a self-licking ice cream cone. It just goes, you know, and we get, you derive no pleasure from that. That we become, you know, we create our own system, and the people that we're trying to serve, our products don't even approach that level by being in the correct language or in an appropriate format for them to even digest, let alone that they don't really want to know about how we're going to attract global funding when they've just been, you know, which is maybe the purpose of many of our products, when we want to, you know, they want to find out where the latest facilities are and where they're open geographically, where they can get health services or any basic services. So, I mean, I think we've got a long way to go on that. It's a great question. It's definitely on the agenda, but there's a lot of work to be done.
We will have a panel next year called the self-licking ice cream cone. We just need to figure out what it's about. So we're very good at extracting data from local communities. What's your thinking around what we can give back and how we can involve them in decision making? Where does that fit?
Me?
Yes, please. Thank you.
This is a tough one. I think once again it's about the right questions. It's if we have answers that might be useful. First of all, we need to be able to collect what are the questions. I think you clearly made the point. I also believe, and again, I go back to my distinction between classic emergencies and this new or protracted and complex type of interventions, where I think the whole interaction with local community need to change. I really think that dealing with a 2 million city can't be a series of focus group with local neighborhood. It doesn't work that way. There is an issue. The scale change the interaction, change the depth of the quality of the information, the type of decision, and we need to scale up. We have some very interesting experience and how we have been able to learn from, let's say, urban communities, but even the term urban community makes you think of, I don't know, something that, I mean, the citizens of a city on how they deal with the limitation in essential service provision and scale up those ideas at a much bigger scale. I really think that maybe even the opposite process is eventually an option, a way to interact. But honestly, how to do it and etc. I don't have the answer, but it's a defining dimension, I believe.
Great, thank you. Natalie?
Thank you. Listening to the panelists, I was just thinking that one huge obstacle to the learning process through unpacking decision-making processes may also be related to the fact that the whole sector has become more and more risk reluctant, and especially reluctant to show its own mistakes. Because if we want to learn something from a decision, we first need to be ready to make some mistakes, and all the accountability processes that we have in place today are more dedicated to show that we are doing good, we are doing well, and not especially to try and understand where are the mistakes, because of a number of huge challenges related to resources, financial issues, political issues, and etc. So maybe we don't want to open the black box, by the way. So I just would just like to hear from ICRC and from OCHA, what is your view on that?
Fail forward.
Okay. I personally agree with everything you said. You just said. I think that the point is that, again, it's a change of culture. We learn much more from failure than from success story. Again, personal opinion, but I think it's pretty much strongly support. And I think as a whole, the industry needs to learn how to fail safe. So this is also part of the design. So failure should be a very realistic outcome, and we need to account it from the very beginning. And that again is a learning part that needs to be reinforced.
I mean, from OCHA's side, I mean, it's a cultural thing within the organization that you create that space where people can fail. We can learn from that, and that's not seen as necessarily a negative thing. From a humanitarian system side thing, I mean, the first thing that popped into my mind when you said that was, so we just had the dual earthquake event for that affected Turkey and northern Syria. And our response was, you know, one of the biggest responses, the biggest response ever in the Turkey response. In northern Syria, we had a very poor initial response to that. And at least my boss, the ERC, admitted quite openly that we failed to respond in northern Syria. However, is that a failure of the humanitarian community or a failure of the overall effort by the United Nations to alleviate this conflict that is protracted? Now we're more than 10 years into that protracted crisis. So those failures are out there. The question is, can we learn from that, double down on the political solution, and quit relying on some of the humanitarian solutions, which are not solutions, which are band-aids that need to be continually applied?
Thank you. We have time for one last question or two, actually, Nick, and then, yeah.
Thanks. I mean, I'm really interested on the idea that, yes, the
contextual information and all the data that we have is really complicated and it's really hard to communicate to decision makers. And I think that is a big challenge. But then is not the also another challenge, the fact that we're not actually honest with ourselves about anything, and that when we're making decisions, we're not honest how we make decisions. When we're considering some of these complex issues, we don't even allow honest debate on these things. So Afghanistan, we don't want to deliver, Afghans want food, but we have a principle that we disagree with the Taliban's directive, so we will not deliver food at the moment, or something like this. You know, we have different priorities to the people who we're trying to serve. And we're not even honest enough to sort of have an open debate about that. Should we? Is it too political, the humanitarian sector now?
Who wants to have a go at honesty? Sarah?
I mean, I've been thinking and reflecting, again, I'm speaking in my own capacity and I've been on sabbatical for a while, so I speak pretty freely about, and maybe far too bluntly about how foreign policy and decision-making in the British government impacts the humanitarian agency industry. But I will just say that so much of this is passed down, you know, poop rolls downhill, right? It feels like some of these decisions are made particularly from big public donor agencies and organizations, and the ability to be honest with ourselves about what fails and what doesn't fail. I remember at DFID Congo, we tried really hard to work with our partners to say that we're really open to your failures, and that lasted for about 6 months until we had directives from London that wasn't really going to fly anymore. That's me speaking quite frankly, and it was a long time ago, but I think that question is absolutely spot on. I think we are not open enough as an industry, nor are donors really willing to accept anything other than perfection 100% of the time. And therefore it creates a culture where you're writing a donor report. We've all been there, you know, starting out and writing loads of donor reports back to ECHO or DFID or USAID or whatever. And you know, you're not necessarily reflecting what you're seeing on the ground. You're not necessarily being honest with yourself, your agency, because the costs are too high. The cost means a reduction in funding, especially in times when funding is increasingly tight and stretched. So I absolutely agree.
Thank you, sir. There's a question here.
So hi, my name is Arwin de Vries. I work at the Rotterdam School of Management. So I teach business analytics to MBA students, among others. And actually, many of the challenges that we've been talking about today, they remind me very much of many of the challenges that we hear in the classroom, right? A lot of businesses have been pouring billions of dollars in becoming data-driven. And they're disappointed by what they're getting out of it, right? We've seen the big data hype, we've seen a hype in the 80s and 90s already with data, now with AI. And actually, as a side note, I think that the humanitarian sector can learn a lot from many of the mistakes that are being made over there. But one of the things that keeps coming back is the disconnect between what we then call the business on the one hand, and the data people on the other hand, right? The engineers, the people that know how to do the coding, to develop the dashboards and so forth, right? And one of the best practices is there to invest in people that know both, right? That know what you can do with data, what different methods are out there, right? Complex to simple, and also know what are the big struggles, what are the big decisions that need better support. Right. So my question here is, what is the view of the panel on the HR side of this question of becoming more data driven or capturing more value from the data that we have in the sector?
I think that's an excellent question, and I'd like all of the panelists to react to it, and maybe any closing remarks you want to throw in there as well. Thank you.
I mean, it's definitely something that has been flagged, not just in our organizations, but there's a UN data strategy out of the Secretary General's office. A big part of that is to push out new profiles in these different analytical areas. And yeah, I call those that skill set, the translator, you know, between the business owner and the tech side and the data analyst side. So we have fine-tuned, our kind of skill sets. But to tell you the truth, we don't have a huge space to hire those new profiles. It's a luxury to have this diversified skill sets that are much needed. So we're repurposing internal staff. So that's more of a capacity building exercise that's happening there. But it is positive that we now have these different kinds of TORs to choose from, and that comes from the top of the UN down. Yeah.
Yeah, again, I agree with the analysis. There is an interface. Again, I think that one of the points to bridge this interface is again the question. You need to have data, but before you need to have a question, because otherwise you are putting answer before something, and you say, look, you need this answer. Then it's also a matter of HR, and it's also a matter of right profile that are able to discuss that. It's one of, if I can then really go back in our internal dynamics, it's one of the reasons of the creation of this new unit. We are a mix between the geek and the one that talk with the different métier that act as planner, because that's what it's about. It's discussing specific things with asking questions. But yeah, it's a challenge.
Thanks, Sarah.
I think it's an excellent question, and I have a couple of thoughts that are similar to what Andrew and Federico already mentioned. I think in terms of critical requirements and skill set, data and technological literacy is no longer a nice to have for anyone, really. And I say this to my 75-year-old mother who lives in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, who pleads ignorance when she picks up her phone. But it's here to stay. Our own individual responsibility to be able to, at the most basic level, understand basic data and how that may or may not drive decision making should be a requirement. And I don't mean that you're an expert in SPSS and you're running bivariate regression analyses or whatever. That it's just basically ends up something that's a little bit of interpretation, a bit like what Andrew was saying. It's sort of, in my mind, a bit like the metaphor for a car. Sort of, I imagine if we had a humanitarian industry in the sort of 1920s, it would have been really difficult to find anyone who'd able to drive a car. But now you'd be hard pressed to recruit humanitarian actor staff for a sort of forward line position without being able to drive. I mean, exceptions obviously noted, but so I think it's sort of being able to understand how to use this stuff. Sorry, there's a child banging on the door, if you can hear that. Versus being able to understand the science behind it. And the second thing around the sort of HR point is the decision between humanitarian, that in front of humanitarian agencies, is do you recruit your own technical experts or do you externally contract them? And I don't have a good answer to that yet. I've seen both sides. I don't think either of them are particularly great. You get data scientists in big agencies and they're one of two people. They can't get traction. They don't get listened to. They are like maybe a little too geeky and techie to be able to like shape some of the politics around the decision making at the highest levels of the institution. But equally, when you go external, you start to lose some of those humanitarian principles and ethics, and you start to get to a point where they don't really maybe understand what the priorities are for humanitarian agencies. So that's a TBD on that one.
Thank you, Sarah. Finally, Ed.
Yeah, quickly, I'll pick up also on the question or the comment, but particularly also what Federico said earlier, when he particularly stressed the importance of qualitative data, which is exactly also often where our challenge is, because the reaction we get back is, oh, these are just opinions. And again, then immediately rejected on that ground, like they're just opinions as such. So, whereas in fact, of course, a lot what we do exactly is collecting qualitative data. So where, and actually, I'm sorry, well, I know we have some excellent people in my organization, working precisely on qualitative data, but perhaps we are behind thinking of this now. And, you know, in terms of how tech or AI for that matter could help us actually in improving even qualitative data. I think there is a field that probably we need to think, as speaking as the director of HERE, that we need to think about more. Lastly, I just want to say, Lars Peter, also to you and to all of you in the room, because you started off saying, you know, you had a good panel last year. I think actually, you know, this one is, speaking for myself at least, I find really, really interesting, because I think you're really touching on the top, you're opening the black box really. And often, most of the time, the black box really remains closed. And I think now we're really hitting on an issue that, you know, we often think it's about the quality of the data and so on. I think the decision making around what is done with that data is at least as important. And I think you're really hitting on a key issue here. So thanks for organizing the panel, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you to the whole panel for excellent interventions and for accepting to answer difficult questions and pushy questions. And thank you to the room for your interventions. It was really an excellent discussion we had. So thank you. We had a little competition at the beginning of the panel. Can we pull up the results, Daniel? We asked you to rank which are the 5 most severe crises in the world. If you had to donate money to 5 crises, which ones would they be? And can we show those? That's very hard to read. Talk about we should have tested this, I think. All right, we're getting there. Okay. Afghanistan, Ukraine, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan. Right. And what we then did was we contrasted that with our severity index. So how close? Yeah, we will have a dashboard for the next year. But I want to say, just from looking at the frequency of the crisis, that's pretty precise, which is probably not surprising in a room of experts like this one. But it actually is interesting to see how many crises were listed and how big the spread was after all. But there's no doubt that the top 5 ones were pretty precise. So thank you for playing that little game. And we have prizes, is that right? Who are the 3 winners? Make that bigger. So if you're a geo nerd or MMM or systems thinker or Molly Mabel or Sittaro or Sefu, you can pick your prizes up from Danielle. Raise your hand, Danielle. In the corner. There we go. Thank you very much for a great discussion, and have a good evening.